My parents' obsession with my brother hid a life-changing truth. Growing up, I always knew I was different. Not in the way most kids feel different, but in a way that cut deeper. It wasn't about how I looked or the way I spoke, it was the way I was treated. From the moment my younger brother, Josh, was born, the shift in my family's attention was undeniable. It wasn't immediate, but over time, I became more of a background character in my own home. Josh was the golden child. It was evident in everything, the way my parents fawned over him, the way they celebrated every little milestone as if he had reinvented the wheel. When I was his age, those same milestones were met with polite applause at best, and at worst, indifference. If I got an A in school, I got a "good job, sweetie," before the conversation shifted back to Josh's latest accomplishment, which could be as insignificant as coloring within the lines. I would sit at the dinner table, silently watching as my parents doted on Josh. They would ask him about his day, listen intently to every word he said, even if it was just about some cartoon he had watched. When it came to me, though, the questions were fewer and the attention shorter. It felt like they were going through the motions, asking me how I was out of obligation rather than genuine interest. I learned quickly that no matter what I said, their eyes would soon drift back to Josh. It wasn't just the conversations. It was the way they showered him with gifts and affection. On birthdays, Josh's parties were extravagant affairs, filled with friends, balloons, and cakes so large they could feed the whole neighborhood. My birthdays, on the other hand, felt like afterthoughts. A cake, a few gifts, and a "happy birthday" before everyone's attention shifted back to whatever Josh wanted to do. He was the center of their universe, and I was the distant planet, orbiting quietly in the background. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, that maybe I was being too sensitive. But deep down, I knew the truth. My parents loved Josh more than me. They wouldn't say it outright, of course. They would never admit it, but actions speak louder than words. And their actions told me everything I needed to know. As the years went by, the favoritism became even more blatant. Josh started middle school, and suddenly, everything revolved around him. My parents attended every one of his school events, showering him with praise for every achievement, no matter how small. I was in high school by then, and my accomplishments, whether it was making honor roll or getting into a prestigious extracurricular program, were barely acknowledged. It wasn't that I didn't try to get their attention. I did. I would work hard in school, push myself to excel in everything I did, hoping that maybe, just maybe, they would notice me. But no matter what I did, it was never enough. Josh could do the bare minimum and be praised like a hero, while my efforts went unnoticed. I remember one night vividly. I had been working on a science project for weeks, pouring my heart and soul into it. I was proud of what I had accomplished, and for once, I was excited to show it to my parents. Maybe this time, they would see me. Maybe this time, they would be proud of me. But when I showed them the project, they barely looked at it. My dad gave me a distracted "that's nice," while my mom was too busy helping Josh with his math homework to even glance at it. I stood there, holding the culmination of weeks of work in my hands, feeling the familiar sting of rejection wash over me. In that moment, I realized something. It didn't matter what I did. I would never be enough for them, not when Josh was around. The worst part was how oblivious they were to it all. If I ever tried to bring it up, they would act surprised, as if they couldn't understand what I was talking about. "We love you both equally," they would say, their voices filled with forced sincerity. But I knew the truth. Deep down, I had always known. As I got older, I started to pull away. I stopped trying to get their attention, stopped seeking their approval. What was the point? I was never going to be the golden child, no matter how hard I tried. Josh had that spot locked down, and I was just a supporting character in their story. But as much as I tried to distance myself, the pain never really went away. It sat there, deep in my chest, a constant reminder of my place in the family. I was the older sibling, the responsible one, the one who was supposed to set an example. But no one ever cared about the pressure that came with that. No one ever asked how it felt to be overshadowed by the one person I was supposed to protect. The only solace I found was in my friends, who became my chosen family. They saw me for who I was, appreciated me for my accomplishments, and never made me feel like I had to compete for their love. But no matter how much I tried to focus on those relationships, the emptiness left by my parents' favoritism lingered. One day, it all came to a head. I was home from college for the weekend, and as usual, the house was filled with stories about Josh, his latest soccer match, his grades, his social life. It was all Josh, all the time. I sat there, listening in silence, trying not to let it get to me. But something snapped inside me that night. Maybe it was the years of built-up resentment finally boiling over, or maybe I had just had enough of being invisible. Whatever it was, I couldn't hold back anymore. I'm still here, you know, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. My parents looked at me, surprised, as if they had forgotten I was even in the room. What are you talking about? My mom asked, her brow furrowed in confusion. I'm talking about the fact that Josh is all you ever care about, I replied, my voice shaking with emotion. I've been sitting here for an hour, and neither of you has asked me a single question about my life. It's always about Josh. It's like I don't even exist. The room fell silent. For the first time in years, I had their full attention. But it didn't feel good. It felt raw, exposed, like I had ripped open a wound that had been festering for far too long. My dad cleared his throat, his face a mixture of shock and guilt. That's not true. We care about you just as much as Josh. Do you? I shot back, my voice rising. Because it sure doesn't feel like it. You don't even notice me unless I'm doing something wrong, and even then, it's like I'm an afterthought. I've been trying to get your attention for years, but you've been too busy with Josh to see it. The words tumbled out before I could stop them, years of pent-up frustration spilling out in one unfiltered burst. I didn't care if I hurt their feelings. I had been hurting for years, and it was time they knew. My mom opened her mouth to say something, but I didn't give her the chance. I stood up from the table, my heart pounding in my chest. I'm done trying to be noticed by you, I said quietly, my voice thick with emotion. I'm done feeling like I'm not enough. And with that, I walked out of the house, leaving behind the family that had never really seen me. Walking away that night felt like liberation, but it also left a hollowness inside me. I spent the next few days replaying the confrontation over and over in my head, trying to make sense of the flood of emotions that had erupted. There was a part of me that felt lighter, almost relieved that I had finally said what I had been holding in for years. But another part of me, the part that still craved their love and validation, wondered if I had made a mistake. Would things be different now? Or had I just pushed them further away? I didn't go back home that weekend. Instead, I stayed at my friend Sarah's place, someone who had always understood me in ways my family never did. We sat on her couch for hours that night, talking about everything, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to censor myself. She listened, offering no judgment, no advice, just space for me to vent. You did what you had to do, Sarah said softly, sipping her coffee. It's about time you stood up for yourself. Yeah, but it doesn't feel that way, I muttered, staring into the mug of tea she'd made for me. It feels like I've just made everything worse. I don't know what I expected, but I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd get it. Sarah shook her head. People like your parents, they're not going to get it overnight. They've had years of treating Josh like the golden boy, and they probably don't even realize what they've done. It's going to take time, if they even realize it at all. Her words stung, but I knew she was right. My parents lived in their own little world, a world where Josh was the sun and I was a distant planet, orbiting just far enough away to be ignored. I wasn't sure if they would ever truly see me. But after that night, I wasn't sure if I wanted them to anymore. A week passed before I got a call from my mom. I was sitting in my dorm room, trying to focus on an essay, when my phone buzzed. Her name flashed on the screen, and my stomach clenched. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but the other part, the part that still longed for some kind of resolution, made me pick up. Hey, Mom, I said, keeping my voice as neutral as possible. There was a pause on the other end before she spoke, her voice soft and hesitant. Hi, sweetie. We haven't heard from you in a while. How's school going? I could tell she was trying to keep things light, but the tension between us was palpable, even through the phone. I wasn't in the mood for small talk. School's fine, I replied, cutting straight to the point. Did you need something? There was another pause, longer this time. When she finally spoke, her voice was filled with uncertainty. I wanted to talk about what happened the other night. I took a deep breath, bracing myself for whatever was coming. Okay. I've been thinking about what you said, she continued. About how we've made you feel. And I just want you to know, we never meant to make you feel that way. We love you, just as much as we love Josh. There it was. The same line they had fed me for years, the one that was supposed to smooth everything over. But this time, I wasn't buying it. I don't doubt that you love me, Mom, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But love isn't enough when it's not shown. You may not have meant to, but you've always treated Josh differently. He gets all of your attention, all of your praise. And I'm just, there. I felt like an afterthought for most of my life. Her silence on the other end was deafening. I wondered if she was finally starting to understand, but I couldn't bring myself to hope for that. Not yet. I don't know what to say, she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't realize you felt that way. Your dad and we've never thought of you as less than Josh. I guess we got caught up in everything. I know, I said, the weight of years of hurt pressing down on my chest. But that doesn't change how it's felt. I've tried to be okay with it for so long, but I can't do it anymore. I need you to understand that." She sighed, and I could hear the exhaustion in her voice. "I don't know how to fix this." I wasn't sure if she could. "I don't know if you can." After that call, things were strained. I didn't go home for another few weeks, choosing instead to stay at school or with Sarah. But the distance didn't feel as freeing as I thought it would. My parents sent texts occasionally, but nothing meaningful, just surface-level questions about school or reminders to come visit. It was like they were trying to pretend everything was fine, as if one conversation could undo years of hurt. When I finally did go back home, the house felt different. There was a tension in the air, an unspoken awareness of the confrontation that had happened weeks earlier. My parents were trying, I could tell. They made more of an effort to ask me about my life, to engage with me, but it all felt forced, like they were checking boxes rather than genuinely trying to rebuild the relationship. And then there was Josh. He, of course, had no idea what had happened. He was still living in his golden bubble, blissfully unaware of the rift between me and our parents. When I walked into the house, he greeted me like nothing had changed, excited to tell me about his latest soccer game and how he had scored the winning goal. My parents beamed with pride as he talked, and for a moment, I felt like I was right back where I started, overlooked, invisible. But something had shifted in me. I wasn't the same person who had sat quietly at the dinner table, swallowing my resentment. I wasn't going to let their favoritism control me anymore. That night, after dinner, I found myself alone in the living room with my dad. He was flipping through the channels on TV, but I could tell he wasn't really watching. His mind was elsewhere, probably on me, probably on what had happened. "Dad," I said, breaking the silence. He glanced over at me, surprised. "Yeah? Do you ever feel like you've treated me differently than Josh?" He blinked, clearly taken aback by the directness of my question. "What do you mean?" "I mean exactly that," I said, keeping my tone even. "Do you think you've treated Josh better than me? Or given him more attention?" He shifted uncomfortably on the couch, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't know if I'd put it that way. But I guess we have focused on Josh a lot. He's just needed more, you know? He's younger, and I don't know. Maybe we haven't been as fair to you as we should have been." Hearing him admit it, even in his awkward, stumbling way, felt like a small victory. But it didn't erase the years of feeling like I didn't matter. "I know Josh is younger," I said softly, "but that doesn't mean I don't need you too. I've been trying to get your attention for so long, and I'm tired of fighting for it." My dad sighed, his eyes clouded with regret. "I didn't realize that. I'm sorry. It wasn't everything I needed to hear, but it was something. And for now, that would have to be enough." After that night, things at home changed, but not in the way I had hoped. My parents' attempts to make up for the years of neglect felt hollow, almost transactional. They asked more questions about my life, but their curiosity seemed obligatory, like they were fulfilling some unspoken quota. It wasn't the genuine interest I had craved for so long. And even though they tried, their attention still drifted back to Josh, as if it was instinctive. Josh, of course, remained oblivious to everything. He continued to bask in the warmth of our parents' love, completely unaware of the tension that simmered beneath the surface. I couldn't blame him, it wasn't his fault that our parents had put him on a pedestal. But being around him felt suffocating. Every interaction with Josh was a reminder of how unequal our relationship had always been, and I couldn't help but feel the resentment boiling up inside me. One evening, I was sitting at the kitchen table, watching Josh excitedly talk about another soccer victory, when something in me snapped. I felt a wave of anger surge through me, the kind that had been building for years. I stood up abruptly, pushing my chair back with a loud screech. "I'm going for a walk," I announced, not waiting for a response before grabbing my jacket and heading for the door. The cold night air hit me as I stepped outside, but it did little to calm the storm raging inside. I walked aimlessly down the street, my thoughts swirling in a chaotic mess of frustration and sadness. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay in that house any longer, not that night, at least. I ended up at a park a few blocks away, sitting down on a bench beneath the glow of a street lamp. The park was quiet, the only sounds the distant hum of traffic and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. For the first time in a while, I let myself feel everything. The hurt, the anger, the loneliness, it all washed over me in waves. I had spent so many years pretending it didn't bother me, pretending I was fine with being overlooked. But now, in the stillness of the night, I couldn't hide from it anymore. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring up at the stars and wondering how things had gone so wrong. I had always thought that if I worked hard enough, if I pushed myself to be better, my parents would finally see me. But no matter what I did, I was always in Josh's shadow, and I was starting to realize that nothing I did would ever change that. As I sat there, lost in thought, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, half expecting it to be my mom or dad checking on me. But instead, it was a message from Sarah. "Hey, you okay? You seemed off earlier. Wanna talk?" I stared at the message for a moment before typing a quick reply, "I'm at the park. Could use some company." Less than 10 minutes later, Sarah appeared, walking towards me with her hands shoved in her pockets. She sat down on the bench beside me without a word, simply offering her presence, which was exactly what I needed. "I take it things at home are still complicated," she said after a few minutes of silence. I let out a bitter laugh. That's putting it lightly. She didn't push for details, and I appreciated that. Instead, she sat with me, letting the quiet settle between us. After a while, I found myself talking, pouring out everything that had been bottled up inside. I told her about the strained conversations with my parents, the forced efforts they were making, and how none of it felt real. I told her about Josh, about how I couldn't even look at him without feeling like I was drowning in resentment. "I don't want to hate him," I admitted, my voice cracking. "It's not his fault. But I can't help it. It's like everything I've ever wanted from them, he just gets automatically. And no matter what I do, I'm always second." Sarah listened, nodding occasionally but letting me vent without interruption. When I finally finished, she turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "You know," she said carefully, "I think the problem isn't just your parents or Josh. It's that you've spent so much time trying to get their approval that you've forgotten about yourself. You've been living for them, waiting for them to notice you, to validate you. But what if you stopped waiting? What if you started living for yourself?" Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. She was right, of course. I had spent my entire life chasing after something that was never going to come. I had been so focused on trying to win my parents' love and attention that I had neglected to figure out who I was outside of that need. I had been living in the shadow of their expectations, and in the process, I had lost sight of what I wanted for myself. "I don't even know where to start," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Sarah smiled gently. "That's the beauty of it. You get to decide. You get to figure out what makes you happy, what gives your life meaning. And it doesn't have to involve them." Her words lingered in my mind long after I left the park that night. For the first time in my life, I started to imagine a future that wasn't defined by my parents' approval. I didn't have to be perfect. I didn't have to compete with Josh. I could just be me, whoever that was. Over the next few months, I made a conscious effort to distance myself from the toxic cycle I had been trapped in for so long. I focused on my own goals, my own passions. I threw myself into my studies, started volunteering at a local shelter, and even picked up painting, something I had always loved but never had the time or energy to pursue. I still saw my parents, of course, but our interactions became more surface level. I stopped seeking their approval, stopped waiting for them to acknowledge me in the way I had always wanted. It wasn't easy, but with time, I found that the less I relied on their validation, the freer I felt. I was no longer trying to fit into the mold they had created for me. I was building my own life, on my own terms. Josh and I remained cordial, but the closeness we might have had as siblings never materialized. I accepted that we would never have the relationship I had once hoped for, but that was okay. I didn't need to be his shadow anymore. One day, while I was packing up my dorm room after graduation, I got a call from my mom. She congratulated me on finishing school, her voice filled with pride, but it didn't hit the way it used to. I thanked her, and we talked briefly about my plans after college. The conversation was polite, almost distant, but for the first time, I didn't feel a pang of disappointment. I had finally come to terms with the fact that my parents might never love me in the way I wanted. And that was okay. Because I had finally learned to love myself.